Hey guys, my name is Graham Johnson. Welcome back to Tabletop Glory, and in today's video we're going to be talking about blood angels, specifically how I paint blood angels. Now, this was kind of an experimental paint scheme so that I can kind of get the idea of how I want to do blood angels in the future, and we're going to be talking about toward the end how we can simplify this paint scheme to make it so that you can replicate it across an entire army. Now, today's video doesn't require any edge highlights, however it does require an airbrush, so if you don't have one, we'll talk about that when we get to it, and we'll talk about some creative ways that you could get around it. Let's get on with the video. Starting out strong, we're going to be picking out our Trifecta of Color. In this case, it's Mephiston Red, it's Corn Red, and Wild Rider Red. Now, Corn Red is a discontinued color, so if you don't have Corn Red available to you, you can just use Mephiston Red and go forward from there. We're going to be using a lot of flow aid today, not just in our airbrush, but as well as across our entire paint job. So if you don't already have a bottle of flow aid, I encourage you to go get some. If you don't have any, you may want to invest in something like Lamian Medium or Contrast Medium. It's going to help you out a lot, but it will require you to do more layers that way than if you just use regular flow aid. Now with this first couple of layers, I actually ended up thinning out the paint a little too much, but that's okay because we just want a nice solid coat. So going a little bit heavier than I normally would will work just fine. We'll just have to keep that in mind going forward with our next few layers to make them a little thicker. Every airbrush is different, so just because I thin mine out in a certain way in a video doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work for you. There's a lot of different factors that can come into play, and if you end up with splattering, it can be everything from your air pressure is too high, all the way to your paint is too thin, and there's a lot of different things that you can adjust in between to make things work for you. I recommend you looking up airbrush tutorials online as opposed to just going by what me or any other YouTuber does for that fact, because it is going to get you more mileage in the end to figure out how your airbrush works instead of somebody telling you how to do it. So this is the first stage of laying in our colors. Normally I would tell you to mix in your first color with your medium color, but in this case we're skipping over that. With the airbrush I can kind of put on these semi-loose, semi-translucent paint layers, and what that does is it basically allows me to build up that fade that I would normally want you to do anyway when painting by hand. So we don't need to do that mix. We're just starting straight in with the Mephiston Red. Now already we're using Liquitex Flow Aid, we're using airbrush thinner from Vallejo, and you saw me even adding some contrast medium in. This is to make sure we get a nice, smooth, creamy blend between our original Corn Red and our new layer of Mephiston Red. Now I'm trying to stay out of the recesses, and I'm not going to be hitting it from underneath. I'm only going to be hitting the model from straight on, directly above, and mostly at a 15-degree angle all the way around the outside. Now the trick with this paint scheme is that as we continue forward and we continue to add more colors, we are not cleaning out the airbrush as we go. We're using the leftover paint that was already in there, and we're adding more colors to it. Specifically, we're moving out of Mephiston Red and into Wild Rider Red. And then when we start to add our final layers, we're going to be using some new paints altogether, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. For now, you're just going to see me constantly be re-adding more and more Wild Rider Red until we get to a pure Wild Rider Red. So as I'm continuing to build up these layers and getting closer and closer to my pure Wild Rider Red, almost like a Zenithal Prime, we're working our way up to our brightest highlights from directly above. Moving swiftly along in our paint scheme here, I tried adding Jericho Orange to kind of brighten things up a little bit, and it didn't really work out. It wasn't making the transition fast enough, and I realized I'd be wasting quite a lot of paint. So I quickly switched over to Everland Sunset to kind of brighten things up and to give it more of an orange pop. This is to give me my most extreme highlights, and it gets a little out of hand, but I'll show you how to knock that back in just a second in case you do the same thing. So with Everland Sunset being a really strong color and making that a really vibrant orange, this wants to be one of our brightest colors on the model. Now, if we were going to be using edge highlights, rather than spraying this as a highlight, I would recommend using this color as your edge highlight and maybe adding a little bit more Everland Sunset just to kind of put it more in the yellow range as opposed to the red-orange range. But this is going to be our brightest highlight, and because it's our brightest highlight, we want to focus mostly from above. Now you'll see me kind of deviate a little bit, and that's to do what I refer to as heroic highlights. That's putting highlights where they don't really make sense because the sunlight wouldn't be able to get to there, but it's just to add a little pop of contrast in a place that normally wouldn't have it. Okay, so you took your contrast just a little too far. Now that's not a problem if you have something like contrast paint. However, you don't have contrast paint, you're going to want to mix up about as close to a wash as you can in the darker tones that you have used. So if you're not painting a blood angel like I am, you're going to want to use whatever that darker color was to begin with. Now, blood angel red tends to be a little bit on the corn red side if you are using a darker base tone as opposed to a brighter base tone. So I'm using blood angel red for contrast paints, and I'm diluting that with a few different mediums, but I'm also adding, you'll see here, a gel retarder. And what that's to do is it's just to thicken up the paint a little bit better and to help it go through the airbrush. As you can see, I only added a single drop. It doesn't really slow down the dry time at all in this quantity. All it does is it just makes the paint a little bit thicker, and it also stops it from losing it in transparency by using a gel medium. Now, before you go and dump out your airbrush, regardless of whether you decide to darken things up using a wash like I did or just leave it the way it was, we can go ahead and take our finest detail brush and use what's left in our color cup to go ahead and fix any last second problem spots. That's places that the airbrush just simply can't get to because of the sculpt of the model, the shape of the model, whatever the case may be. Sometimes we just can't get the airbrush in there. So we want to go ahead and take this last highlight layer and just very lightly glaze it into those places just to add a pop of color and to make sure we get rid of whatever that primer is underneath so that we can't really see it anymore. Now, in the case of certain colors, meaning that if you're trying to paint yellows and things like that, you may want to do this step a little bit sooner instead of doing it now, just because our highlight range in yellow happens so quickly, but that's something you're going to have to eyeball and just kind of figure out on your own, unfortunately. Soft spots. What's that you say? Soft spots on a Marine? Yeah, soft spots. Back of the knees on some of the newer sculpts, even sometimes around the ankles or in between the elbows and around the hands, in fact. There are soft spots on the armor. These are spots that are meant to be flexible and are made out of maybe some kind of durable rubber material. Depending on the faction, I entirely use different colors for these soft spots just as a way to add a bit of contrast or a pop of color. A lot of people like to paint these gaskets black, and I honestly used to paint them that way as well. However, on some models, especially like in this case where we're using lots of reds and oranges, black is a stark color that I want to make sure that when I use it is going to pop and actually mean something. So in this case, I'm going to be painting all those gaskets gray. Now, I am going to be using a black wash on top of it, kind of knock everything down and add some depth to everything, but I'm painting it gray for a very specific purpose and a specific reason, and that reason is contrast. Now, as long as we got that non-oil out, let's go ahead and put some in the vents. We're going to be adding some panel liner to that later and really darkening it up, but for now, this is good enough. We're going to be talking about how to make your own panel liner later as well, so it's another good reason to have gone out and bought some Liquitex Flow Aid. Now, this is a personal preference of mine, but I don't like being able to see the back of that cowl unless it's fully painted. So if you had the ability to paint it with the head removed, I recommend doing that. In my case, everything was kind of all one sculpted piece together. So I'm just gonna go ahead and slap some non-oil here on some details, and then I'm gonna slap some non-oil in the back of that cowl. Breaking out the Abaddon Black, we're going to be using this to paint the handle on the weapon as well as the cords that connect the weapon to the Space Marine themselves. You could decide to put some edge highlights on this if you wanted to. I end up using a little bit of some Incubi Darkness to kind of add a little bit of contrast without going completely outside of the black spectrum, but that's entirely up to you. Now, I want to take a second to talk about the base, as I'm not really going to be talking about a lot of the colors that are going on it. I end up using a mishmash of colors, and it's entirely up to you what you want to do. But the layering of colors that I use is what I think helps to build up a more natural looking rubble effect, which is just a mixture of browns and grays and then browns again, but starting off with base tones, moving into layers, and then going all the way up to washes. You'll see the process. I won't cut anything out, but I'm not going to talk about the colors because, in my opinion, the colors aren't all that important. You can use whatever browns you want, whatever grays you want, whatever washes you want, as long as you get the effect that you're happy with. Now I want to take a second to talk about the metallics that I'm using, because for some reason I don't like doing my metallics all at once. I like doing them as I come to them. So you'll see me oftentimes, regardless of what model I'm painting, whether it's this video or other videos, where I'm kind of just jumping around constantly adding colors to metallics. Now there are three main colors that I use for the metallics in this video, and that is gunmetal from Vallejo, silver from Vallejo, and I'm using Retributor armor from Citadel. Now, with the Vallejo paints, those are alcohol-based paints, and I do have to make sure that they're completely dry before I interact with them with any other product, because when they mix with the alcohol, it can do a little bit of a weird thing, but because they're alcohol-based paints, they dry really, really quickly. Tamiya Panel Liner is a product that I highly recommend that any hobbyist have in their collection. However, there is a thing that happens with it where it can get out of your control very quickly. It doesn't give perfectly straight lines, so it's really great if you've got shaky hands. This is a product that can work for you, but it's not going to give you the cleanest line work, and as a result, I don't tend to like using it, because a lot of times it requires you to kind of go back over things and fix things and touch things up, and especially when you've used an airbrush, that just doesn't really work for us. So we need something that's going to be a little bit more precise, and to do that we need to make our own panel liner. Now my preferred way of doing that is simply by using Liquitex Flow Aid, and we're going to use that along with some Abaddon Black, and we're going to make our own panel liner. Now you could use some things like contrast mediums and other things like that to make it a little more translucent if you want it that way, but I think it works just fine. Now the really great thing about this is we can paint it on exactly where we want it, and we can be a little bit sloppy, and because of the nature of panel liner, as it dries it will suck into the creases and crevices and stay where we need it to be. Now it will tint the surface just a little bit, but it is significantly less noticeable than if we had used panel liner. And similar to panel liner, if we do make a mistake with it, we can just wipe it off right away with our finger, as opposed to having to flood out the model like we would with something else when we make a mistake, where we have to go back in with a wet brush and completely flood out that area to clean it up. Now one of the things you're going to notice me doing is I'm actually applying this pretty much everywhere. If there's a crack, a crevice, or whatever, I am putting it there. I'm putting it in all the little panels, I'm going all over every little thing, and this is going to help things to pop a lot. Now, if you were being a little lazy, or perhaps maybe you've got some shaky hands, or you're going to do this across a whole army, I recommend only doing it where the actual panel lines are, so anywhere where there's a nice deep cut, and maybe on the back of the legs or on the front of the calves, and I would just leave it as that. Instead of going all over like I'm doing this way, just because it's a really great way to save time, especially if you're going to do this across a whole army. I don't think you want to do this step to the extreme that I'm doing it, as it's very time consuming. Once again, I felt the need to go ahead and add a dark brown wash. This case I'm using panel liner just because it's going to soak into all those cracks and crevices, but you could also use Liquitex Flow Aid. Putting on some more metallics now, and I just want to take a second to talk about the amount of contrast that metallic paint offers, especially when against a matte paint like the red that we put all over everything else. So just understand that the more metallics, the more or less contrast you're going to end up with in certain places, which is why I'm focusing my brightest colors across the chest and highlight zones, as well as the back of the shield, just to add a little pop of color. And I'm also putting it in the lenses, because if you put a little bit of a wash on top of it, it'll make it look like a nice colored lens. Moving straight into all of the bone. Now I did forget to record the bulk of this, but we're just going to go ahead and redo part of the bone here so that I can show you what I'm doing. Now this is a diluted XV88, this is our base tone, and then we're going to slowly add more and more Screaming Skull into this and build the color up from there. Now this is a lot of passes, and if you just want to kind of mitigate that, you could do a pass of XV88 and then go ahead and dry brush Screaming Skull on top of it, but if you do a lot of thin glazes like I'm doing, you'll end up with a much smoother result. Don't forget to add a wash of Agrax Earthshade across all of your bone. If you don't have Agrax Earthshade, you can use any kind of a dirt color and just water it down. But go ahead and add some Agrax Earthshade all over that before you do your final stages of highlights. Again, if you don't want to spend all the extra time to glaze up, you could just use a dry brush. So I want to take a hot second to talk about the trim. Now I'm doing the trim on the shield in gold, and it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times when painting Blood Angels, the trim is going to be gold. At least that is the traditional colors. So if you're doing regular Space Marines where there's the trim around the shoulder pauldron, go ahead and paint that gold, and any other fancy trim that may be going on, like the Aquillas and things across the chest, go ahead and paint those gold now. Now, if you want to do an alternative paint scheme, you could with the Aquila. You could do it in black and highlight with gray. I've seen it done that way. It's kind of a alternative paint scheme to do them in all black, almost like a Death Watch type of thing. And I've seen people combine the two schemes by doing all their trim in black as well, and that is an option that is to you. If you want to do it that way though, I still recommend on shields doing the outside edge in gold. Now in my case, I don't end up using a wash on my gold. I just do it straight as gold Retributor armor out of the pot. I should have put a little bit of a wash and then re-highlighted, but I was scrapped for time to go ahead and get this video out, so I did skimp back on that detail. And if I were going to be doing this across an entire army, I would probably be doing it that way too. It's just one less step to worry about. It's just a quick strip of gold around the outside edge on those shields and you're done. Now, while I work on a few more little metallic bits, I want to take a second to talk about all the little cracks. Now, you've noticed they've been painted for a while, all those little sculpted scratches and details. I just went ahead and did that with Vallejo Metal Color Silver. Now, there is no real rhyme or reason as to how I do it, other than the fact that I start with my paintbrush on the edge of a crack, work my way into the middle, and then go to the opposite end and work my way into the middle. And the big reason for that is because where you lift your brush up is where you're going to leave a big deposit of paint, and you don't want to be having one of the ends of those little scratch marks being significantly thicker than the other. And now for the beautiful yet not so beautiful world of flesh tones. Now, flesh can be really tricky, and it's entirely up to you to decide how all out you want to go on this. However, using Bugman's Glow as your base tone really is the way to go forward, even if you're not going to be using Citadel paints. Try to get a color similar to that as your base tone. And then we're going to be highlighting up from there using Kislev Flesh. Now, I mix my Bugman's Glow and my Kislev Flesh together in a 50-50 and slowly continue to add more Kislev Flesh until I'm happy with the highlights. Once I'm happy with that, it's time to put a little bit of color in using Reikland Flesh Shade, and then we're going to be re-highlighting with almost pure Kislev Flesh, but this time as a glaze. And we're slowly going to build up that color on the upper lips, down around the eyes and the eye sockets. You're going to also want to accentuate the jaw and up and down right next to where the ear would be. And you may want to put a little glaze across the top of the head as well if this is a bald character. Originally I wanted to try and sculpt some kind of lightning bolt, but I think there's a mix between my brush not being quite small enough and just never having done it before. It just didn't work, so I'm going to go ahead and cover that up with some gunmetal. And yeah, I really want to try to figure out how to do lightning bolts, but it really eludes me. So if you guys know of a good tutorial online on how to do lightning bolts, feel free to let me know in the comments so I can go check that out and maybe come up with my own version that works for miniatures. And here again, I was just adding a bunch of detail to the base, doing a mixture of dry brushing to get those bricks looking more like bricks, using a bit of orange there. I also end up going in with a bit of Incubi Darkness and some Abaddon Black to do those tiles. And then I kind of hit everything off and highlighted up all of the metal and things like that to try to get things looking a little bit better. Now, I am going to talk a bit more about this with the basing, as this is a topic I don't think I've quite covered. Is Tamiya makes these really awesome weathering pigments. Now, we have done a tutorial here on the channel before about weathering pigments where you can make your own, but I'm basically doing this and I'm dry brushing them directly onto the base and kind of blending the feet in a little bit more to make him look like he's a part of the environment. And with that, we've done it. This is the end of my paint scheme. Now stick around for a second. Normally we would end the video here, but we're going to be talking about how we can take this paint scheme and simplify it so that you can do this across an entire army. So we're going to do a bit of a breakdown. I'm going to go back through and we're going to reevaluate some of these color choices, and we're going to talk about how we could improve this a bit. Number one, when it comes to simplifying the paint scheme, we used a lot of different reds and a lot of other colors. So if we wanted to go ahead and simplify things, we could start off with Mephiston red. We could then add Jericho orange as a secondary highlight, and as a tertiary highlight, we could add our Averland sunset. Now, if you don't have an airbrush, that's not a big deal. You could mix these colors up on a palette and then use dry brushing to do that. However, I recommend that when you go to put our Everland Sunset layer on, you do your best to make sure that your highlights are only going in the places where sunlight would be directly exposed. So mostly just the upper end. Like we talked about earlier, it's basically a zenithal highlight but with color instead of just black, white, and gray. Number 2, if I could change anything about the metallics, I would change the way that we use the metallics. I would use gunmetal for pretty much everything that's silver. I would use the Retributor armor the same way that we have used it, and I would only use the silver for extreme highlights in places where I really wanted a pop of color. And that is all I would change about the metallics. Number 3, we have our bone. Now, the bone is pretty much about as good as we're gonna get it when I talked about the dry brush. We wanna hit it with that XV88 first, then we're gonna wanna go ahead and hit it with an Agrax Earthshade, and then we're gonna go ahead and dry brush that with Screaming Skull. Now, you may wanna do 2 layers of the Screaming Skull just to kinda get rid of any chalkiness and to make sure you get a good fade between the XV88 and the Screaming Skull. Number 4, I would avoid the panel lining altogether, and I would do a little bit of edge highlighting using a mixture of our Everland Sunset and our Wild Rider Red. But I would only focus this highlight on leading edges, meaning places where I need the face to be framed or places where the weapon is massively important, meaning that that is the focus of what is going on. So we're gonna keep our highlights around the face. We might do a little bit of highlighting around the wrist and elbow, a bit on the shoulder, but we're not gonna go all up and down the legs. That's gonna speed things up for doing an entire army. And lastly, I'm gonna cut out the weathering pigments, and we're just gonna use washes when it comes to the base. That's gonna be one of the big defining factors after you build up some base tones, which we're all going to be using on the other parts of the model anyway. Now, I'm not gonna change anything about the soft spots, as those were easy enough. You just slap a bit of gray, a bit of black wash, and you're done. However, when it comes to the weathering pigments, it can take a little while to build up the color that you want. Whereas if you just took a bit of a wash and kind of slapped it in around the feet and across the whole base, you're gonna be done pretty quickly. Now, it's entirely up to you, because the bases could be a place that you really wanna spend that extra time, because it's gonna be a place that's gonna help blend everything in across your entire army. But also, having unified faces and having all of your logos bright and in your face is going to be rather important. So maybe you want to spend that extra time doing all of the edge highlighting on your Aquillas and making sure your faces look good. And surprisingly enough, I have no quarrels with the way that I did skin tones, as I feel skin tones are very important with doing them the way that I did them and spending the amount of time on them that I did. Although it wasn't all that much time, it is important to spend the proper amount of time, or you're just gonna end up with a gummed up looking face and it's not gonna look good. Now, also similar to how I painted my model today, I have no intention on trying to paint the eyes. Now, if you do have a helmet on your character, you are gonna wanna paint those visors, and you can paint that by just putting a couple of layers worth of wash in them and then putting a little dot of a highlight in there. That's a really good cheater way to do it. But I wouldn't spend a ton of time trying to do this, and some people even just put a black wash in the eye sockets as well as a black wash in the lens sockets and just leave it at that and let it be theater of the mind. And that works great too. Well, anyway, that wraps it up for this week's video. Hopefully you guys who wanted the Blood Angel stuff had just a little bit of a satiated appetite, just a little bit. But in any case, I plan to do more Blood Angel stuff in the future. I would like to do a Lamentor's kill team at some point, but if there is any kind of a paint scheme that you guys would like to see, whether it's an alternative paint scheme, a successor chapter, whatever the case may be, post it in the comments, and if something seems really interesting or something gets a lot of likes, we're gonna go ahead and do that one for you guys. But in any case, thank you guys so much for all the love and support. I am blown away by how many people are following this channel and by all of you who are actively commenting and being a part of this channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for everyone who's gone and voted on the poll as well. I'm going to try to do more polls in the future so that I can get a good idea of the type of content you guys want to see. There are some more terrain projects coming in the future. However, I'm working on one really large one right now. In fact, I'm working on 2 really large ones, but one is going to take quite a while to film. Hopefully you guys will really enjoy that. Several of you guys have been asking me to also do some themed videos, as if to say that to put on a character, and I do plan to do that. I've done them on lives from time to time on TikTok, and they seem to do really well, and we're gonna have one of those in the mix, hopefully coming up toward the end of the month. In any case, thank you guys so much for all the love and support, and until next time, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty.